in Mark chapter 10 this morning, verses 32 to 52. And we're going to be closing out kind of this middle section of the Gospel of Mark that really has been kind of a discipleship 101 class. If you'll remember, a few weeks ago, we kind of hit that transition point in the Gospel of Mark where Jesus began, in response to Peter's confession of him as the Christ, to teach his disciples what it would mean for him to be the Messiah, what it would look like and how things would play out as they began to move from Galilee toward Jerusalem. Well, we kind of come to the culmination of that section today, and we find here, as we launch into Mark chapter 10, verse 32, Jesus predicting his death and his resurrection among his disciples for a third time. And we're just going to jump right in, okay? And I want you to see several things as we begin to walk through this passage. Mark chapter 10, verse 32, this is the word of the Lord. And they were on the road going up to Jerusalem. Right? So picture this. Jerusalem and Jericho are about 20 miles apart. The reason that Mark tells us that they were going up to Jerusalem, and it has to do with the elevation difference, okay? They may have only been 20 miles apart, but Jerusalem was 3,500 feet higher in elevation than the city of Jericho. And so to go up to Jerusalem was a literal journey. But there's also something deeper going on here, because Mark wants us to key in on the fact that Jesus is about to walk up a very difficult hill. He's about to embrace his calling as the suffering servant. And so to walk up to Jerusalem, literally for Jesus, is going to mean to walk up to Golgotha, the place of the skull, the place where he's going to give his life. And notice something else in that verse. It says they were walking on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them. Right? Like it's a picture of Jesus, the Messiah and the suffering servant, with purpose and with intentionality, out in front of his disciples as the good shepherd, leading them where they need to go. It's also a reminder, a subtle one, that Jesus is not going up to Jerusalem as a victim. He's not going up to Jerusalem because someone is twisting his arm. Jesus, the authoritative one, is out front. He has his face set on Jerusalem. And it's been that way from the beginning of his ministry. Mark writes that his disciples were all amazed, and those who followed him were afraid, right? Like twice, Jesus has predicted his death and his resurrection, and Jesus is resolute in purpose, moving toward Jerusalem. And at this point, his disciples, they just aren't quite sure what to make of, right? Like they can't come to grips with these almost outlandish predictions that Jesus is making. And so we read, and taking the 12 again, he began to tell them what was going to happen to them, saying, see? Okay, now underline that word, circle that word, see. It's going to be key by the time we get to the end of this passage. See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man, by the way, that title for Jesus is the title he uses for himself most often in the Gospel of Mark. He uses it 14 times. Right? And there's a lot behind it, okay, that we're not going to get into today. At some point in the future, I'm going to put that in front of you. And hopefully it'll give you a good idea for how Jesus sees himself, okay? See, we're going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the scribes. And they will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles. And they will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him. And after 3 days, he will rise. Now, out of the three predictions in Mark 8, in Mark 9, and here again in Mark 10, this is the most detailed and most specific, okay? Jesus here tells us that he's going to be handed over to suffering by the chief priests and the scribes and the elders, the religious leaders of his own people, and then he's going to actually be put to death by the Gentiles. Now, he gets even more specific. He says they're going to mock him, they're going to spit on him, they're going to flog him, and they're going to kill him. Okay? The idea here, and this is really a setup for what's about to happen. Okay? Jesus is being incredibly detailed with his disciples about what he's going to have to endure as the Messiah. Suffering, 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 neon light, in terms of what Jesus has come for. Now I want you to watch what begins to transpire. And James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came up to him and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask you." Now here's what you need to picture. If you're a parent, this has probably happened to you. Dad, I'm going to ask you something, and you got to promise me that you won't say no. That's what's happening here. And it's almost as if James and John know before they even make their specific request that it's wrong. Okay? They feel it deep in their hearts that what's about to come out of their mouths is somehow at cross purposes with what Jesus came to do. But they ask it anyway. They essentially want a blank check from Jesus. Now, here's what I'm going to tell you. Y'all, in our culture, it is so easy to treat the Lord Jesus in the exact same way. To think that God is in the business of providing for and pleasing and meeting all of our wants and desires and needs, right? So that we get everything we've ever dreamed for. You know, in 2005, Christian Smith, who's a sociologist, and a group of researchers at the University of North Carolina did a study called the Study of Youth and Religion in America. And they essentially found, through their sociological study of thousands of teenagers at the time, that there is a predominant religion among most teenagers in the United States. And it's called moralistic, therapeutic deism. That's the term that they coined for it. And you can take each of those words, and there are some descriptors that go along with it. Moralistic. Ultimately, many teenagers at the time believed God simply wants us to be good and fair and help one another, as taught in the Bible and most world religions. In other words, God just wants us to be good. Okay? Therapeutic. The idea that it's all about me feeling good about myself. In other words, God just wants me to be happy. God doesn't care about me being holy. God just wants me to be happy. And then the whole deism thing, the fact that somewhere out there there's a God who created everything that is, and hey, guess what? If I have a problem, or if I need help, or if I'm having a bad day, I can call on him and he'll step into my life and he'll fix my problem. But other than that, he's just kind of hanging out up there, just making sure everything runs smoothly so that I can have the best life possible that I could imagine. Moralistic, therapeutic deism. Now, it's been about 13 to 14 years since that study was released. And they followed all of those teenagers into young adulthood. And did you know, and you can probably feel it right in our culture, that whole me-centered religion has only grown and developed and prospered like a cancer. Now, we have a hard time seeing it because we're swimming in it like a fish who swims in water and doesn't really pay attention to the water just because it's what he knows every day. But y'all, the consumer choices and the fact that I'm at the center of my world has only grown. I love Netflix. I love the choice, and I love the potential that all of these platforms provide for watching what you want, when you want, how you want, however many times you want, right? But what does it it make us into? What's it forming us into? People who think that we're at the center of the equation. My girls are growing up in a world where they don't even have to watch commercials. So whenever we're watching live TV, Eleanor will go, Daddy, fast forward the commercials. Maybe I can't do that. It's live TV, right? But we're being formed and shaped into people with thousands of choices in front of us, all vying for our attention and our affection. And guess what? God ends up being one of those choices. And more than a choice, God ends up being the helper who can get me what I want, when I want, however I want it, rather than being the God and King of the universe. And it's all on display right here. We want you to do for us whatever we ask you. Wow! What arrogance! What pride! But that's the nature of all of our hearts. Because we're just like Adam and Eve, who in the garden decided, we know better than God. And they chose their own path rather than the path that God had laid out for them. So Jesus is here nothing more than a genie in a bottle to these disciples who want what they want. But I want you to notice Jesus. Jesus is the ever-patient teacher. Jesus is the ever-patient king who is committed to these disciples, who is committed to ultimately transforming them into the man he wants them to be. So what does he do? He entertains their request. And he says, what do you want me to do for you? Wow. Okay, so Jesus is going to give us the blank check. Right? So here James and John go. And they said to him, grant us to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory. Okay? They want prestige. They want prominence. They want authority. They want power. They want position. They want notoriety. They want to go to the front of the line. They want the best seats in the house. They want to be recognized. They want to be ruling and reigning right here with Jesus. And they want everybody else to acknowledge them. Because guess what? They don't ask for positions for the other 10 disciples. It's like, forget y'all. We're going to get ours. That's exactly what's happening. Now Jesus, knowing their hearts, okay? Verse 38, he says, guys, you don't know what you're asking. You have no idea what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or to be baptized with the baptism with which I'm baptized? Those are two pictures in the Old Testament of the wrath of God. Okay, the cup of God's wrath is pictured in the prophets and in the Psalms as well, of something that those who are under God's wrath have to drink. And the Old Testament talks about those who are under God's wrath drinking it to the dregs, right? That stuff at the bottom of the cup of coffee that you just want to spit out. And Jesus is saying here, guys, if you're going to entertain these thoughts about glory, you got to recognize that suffering comes first. Not only suffering, but the ability to bear the very wrath of God. The whole idea of baptism comes from the children of Israel being at the Red Sea and passing through the Red Sea, and then the Egyptian army coming after them. And what happened to the waters? The waters crashed in upon them. And Jesus is saying, guys, you don't know what you're asking. Because in order to follow me, or in order to take my place, you've got to be able to undergo the baptism of the rushing river of the wrath of God. Guys, you don't know what you're asking. Now, Now, if you think it couldn't get any worse, verse 39. And they said to him, we can do it. We got this. Now, the disciples have done this before, right? Just a couple of chapters ago, the whole scene with not being able to cast out the demon because they weren't trusting in Jesus' power. We got this. We can do this. Now, notice what Jesus says. He says, guys, I'm just going to give you a little window into what's coming for you. He says, the cup that I drink, you will drink. And the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or at my left is not mine to grant, but it's for those for whom it's been prepared. In other words, Jesus doesn't have authority to set the seating chart in the kingdom. Okay? It's not something that's given to him. It's something that his Father will determine. So the seats at his right and left hand are not his to give away. But what does he say to him? He says, guys, that's something you need to trust God with down the road. But here's what you need to know. If you continue to follow me, you're going to face exactly what I'm going to face. He's preparing them to walk through his own suffering, but as a disciple, he's preparing them to face in themselves the same kinds of suffering. Now, they're not going to die as a payment for sin. That's only something Jesus can do. But from church history, we know that all of these men, save Judas, died because of their faith in Jesus. Right? They did. They gave it all because Jesus had given all for them. And Jesus doesn't pull any punches with these guys, right? He wants them to be well prepared. Now in verse 41 we read, and when the 10 heard it, they began to be indignant at James and John. Now that's funny too, because these guys are thinking, why didn't we think of that? And they're also thinking, I can't believe these two brothers. They completely threw us under the bus. They didn't even think of us. They're going to save all the prominent positions for themselves, and we're going to be their lackeys. So they became indignant. And Jesus called them to himself, and he said to them, you know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. But it shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, to give his life as a ransom for many. Now, the idea here is that in the kingdom of God, service is the greatest and primary virtue. There is nothing higher, nothing greater, nothing to be more celebrated than love in action. That's what Jesus is saying. And it culminates the prior two discipleship teachings. The one about taking up your cross and denying yourself. And the one about being the greatest of all is the least of all. What does that look like? Well, it looks like love in action. It looks like laying your own life down for the benefit of others. It looks like making a beeline to the back of the line so that you can build up and help others move forward. That's what life in the kingdom of God looks like. And Jesus says something really specific here. He says, among you guys, right? Among my disciples, in this community of believers, greatness looks like every single brother and sister stooping low to serve one another. In other words, in the church, where the kingdom of God is on display as the Spirit works in us, it's not to be about my kingdom. It's not to be about your glory. It's not to be about your ministry or your thing or my thing. It's to be about building others up in service. It's to be about cross-shaped love. In other words, notice what Jesus is doing, okay? He's not just laying down a law or a principle. He's pointing to his person. What does he say in verse 45? For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. So why is service the primary virtue in the kingdom? Because it's the character of the king. Service is the primary virtue in God's kingdom because it's who the king is. He's a servant and he's a giver. And his giving goes all the way to the point of laying down his own life for the sins of his people. Notice what he says. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. That whole word, that little word for, it just means in place of. Now, I want you to hear something. We did this on the very first week that we stepped into the Gospel of Mark. I had you turn to this verse, and I had you underline it. I had you highlight it. I had you star it. I had you put glue around it and pour glitter on it. Okay? This is the key verse to understanding the Gospel of Mark. Mark 10:45. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. If you don't memorize anything else in this book, memorize that verse. Because it is essential to understanding Mark. It's essential to understanding Jesus, his purpose, his mission, his intention, and it's essential to understanding the gospel. Jesus came as a substitute for sinners. In other words, you and I deserve nothing but death. We deserve God's wrath because of who we are as sinners and because of the lives of rebellion that each of us has lived. But Jesus came as the perfect Lamb of God. Sinless, spotless. He lived the life you and I could never live. So that when he climbed up on the cross and he died the death that you and I owed and paid a debt that we could never pay because it is eternally big. And he did that in our place. As a ransom for or on behalf of the many. That whole word ransom means to pay the debt of. Or to set prisoners free from slavery. Jesus came to do just that. In our stead, to pay the price for our sin. He came to do that for his disciples. He came to do that for these men whose hearts were exposed in this moment, right? Like the rot inside of them came to the surface. And you and I can see it for what it is. And Jesus tells them that he came to serve their deepest need to the very darkest parts of their heart in order to rescue them from their sin and from themselves. And to transform them into men who live for him and live to give God glory and live to serve one another and those around them. And that's the cure, right? Like that's the cure for the rot in the human heart. But I want you to notice one other thing in this passage. You have here a final story that closes out this section of Mark before we begin to transition into Jerusalem and into the final week of Jesus' life. This is the last miracle in the book of Mark. Now we've seen a lot of them, right? We've seen a lot of healings. We've seen a lot of demons cast out of folks. We've seen all kinds of authoritative teaching. This is the last one before the resurrection of Jesus. And it's integral to culminating and summing up this whole section of discipleship. Okay? So Mark writes, and they came to Jericho. So they obviously spent some time there, and Jesus did some ministry there. And Mark goes on to write in the next sentence that as he was leaving Jericho with his disciples and a great crowd, Bartimaeus, which simply means son of Timaeus, a blind beggar, was sitting by the roadside. Now, Bartimaeus is the only person in the Gospel of Mark who is healed, who is also named. All of the other people in the Gospel of Mark who are healed are not named. So right here is something really significant about who Jesus is and about what he's doing. So Bartimaeus was a blind beggar, the son of Timaeus, and he was sitting by the roadside. Okay? Jesus is leaving Jericho with his disciples. He's leaving Jericho with a crowd of people, and they're headed up to the city of Jerusalem. And when Bartimaeus, verse 47, heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to cry out and say, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." And many in the crowd rebuked him, telling him to be silent. But he cried out all the more, "Son of David, have mercy on me." So here you have this guy, blind beggar, sitting by the roadside, probably covered up in his cloak, probably dirty, probably smelly, probably an outcast in terms of the city of Jericho. We certainly know that the crowd did not think he should be bothering Jesus with his petty problems. Right? They wanted him to be quiet. They wanted to kind of push him out of the way and shush him and move him to the side. Because Jesus got more important things to do than mess with some blind old beggar. Right? But he cries out one time. And then he cries out again. And I love what Jesus does. Mark says Jesus stopped. He stopped. And what did he say? Call him. Call him. Tell him to come here. And they called the blind man, saying, "Take heart, get up. He's calling." And throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. And Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" Uh-oh. Okay. Now. See? Where did you just hear that question? I mean, literally. In the previous story. Which means Mark is doing something incredibly important here. By this question, he's linking these two stories. Because he wants us to compare and contrast James's answer and John's answer with the answer of Bartimaeus. In other words, these two dudes don't yet get it, but what you're going to see is this blind beggar man. He gets it. "What do you want me to do for you?" And the blind man said to him, "Rabbi, let me recover my sight." Remember, I had you circle the word "see" in verse 33 at the very beginning. If you walk back through chapter 10, and then through chapter 9, and then through chapter 8, back to the scene where Jesus is in the boat with his disciples after the feeding of the 4,000. Turn there, because I want you to see this. Verse 17 of Mark chapter 8. And Jesus, aware of this, said to them, "Why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive or understand? Are your hearts hard-hearted? Having eyes, do you not" what? See. "And having eyes, do you not hear? And do you not remember?" So you get over here to this final story in this middle Discipleship 101 section of Mark, and Jesus asks this question of this beggar, "What do you want me to do for you?" And Bartimaeus says, Jesus, I want to see. Jesus, I want to see. And Jesus heals him. And Jesus heals not only his eyes, Jesus restores him spiritually. Look at what happens. And the blind man said to him, Rabbi, let me recover my sight. And Jesus said to him, go your way. Your faith has made you well. When he says your faith has made you well, a better way to translate it would be your faith has saved you. It's the word used of salvation in the New Testament. And then immediately, watch. He recovered his sight, and what did he do? He followed Jesus on the way. On the way to where? Jerusalem. Why? Why is Jesus going there? Because he's going to die. Bartimaeus is a model disciple. He comes at the end of this Discipleship 101 section to show us and to showcase for the disciples what it really means to follow Jesus. Notice just a few things about it, okay? Number one, he confesses Jesus as the Christ. He says, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. That's a messianic title. Okay, so going back to the beginning of this section, Peter also confessed Jesus as the Christ, right? But he and the other disciples didn't really understand what that meant for Jesus to be the king. That he was ultimately going to die for the sins of the world. Fast forward to this scene, where Bartimaeus says, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. And the story ends with Bartimaeus getting up and following Jesus to Jerusalem. You have the picture of someone who gets it, who knows where Jesus is going, and doesn't care what it costs to follow him. Notice also what he asks for. James and John asked for glory and prominence and power and position and prestige, right? They weren't even thinking about the cross. But what does he ask for? Mercy. Mercy. You see, when you and I really and truly come to Jesus, it's not power and glory we're after, it's what? Mercy. It's mercy. Because we know how bad we are. And we know how much we need it. And we know that his authority isn't just for casting out demons and for healing physical ailments. His authority is to dispense forgiveness. And to dispense it freely to any and all who will simply ask. So he asks, Jesus, I want to see. And Jesus says, go. Your faith has saved you. And we know it's not just a physical healing, because he left everything behind. And what did he do? He followed Jesus. And he did it joyfully. He did it eagerly. He did it expecting. Did you notice when the people told him that Jesus wanted to see him, how he got up? He sprang up. I love that. Like, Mark doesn't always provide a lot of detail. So when he does, it's important to pay attention to it. He threw off his cloak. He sprang up. And I got to imagine that he was knocking people down left and right to get to Jesus. Get out of my way. He wants to see me. Nothing could stand in his way. Jesus was calling and the dude had to go. That is discipleship. To know that Jesus is the Christ and to confess him so with your mouth. To know in your heart that he saves sinners and he can save you. And to know when he calls and he's calling you and you come running and you give him your heart and he gives you life and you get up and you go hard after it. It's a picture for the disciples and for us. And if you're here today, and you're like blind Bartimaeus, and you know you need Jesus, guess what? He'll receive with open arms and with healing, and He will change you. He will transform you, and He will give your life new purpose that you never had before. He'll call you to follow Him, and man, it'll mean death. Because a lot of things in your life will have to go. But it'll also mean life upon life upon life upon life. Because He's not just going to die, what's He going to do? Resurrect. If that's you today, I'm going to be down front. We'll have some of our elders and some ladies down front as well. I just want to encourage you to come and pray. Come and talk to us. Let us help you come to know this Jesus. And brothers and sisters, as you think about these things too, God, think about your own life in light of who Bartimaeus is, in light of the fact that he was and is the model disciple. And hold these words up as a mirror to your own heart. And ask the Lord to search you and examine you. And come back to Jesus today, if you're far away. Let's, Father.